But his horrific death, where his jaw literally fell off, culminated in what may be the greatest headline of all time. The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. So I want to talk about the discovery, the history, and the horrific accidents that have coloured our understanding of nuclear energy. If you missed the first episode and you want to know more about the technical side of particle physics, which is way, way more interesting than I make it sound, I promise, pop over to episode 1. But it's not super important for this. In the 1910s, radium was in everything from toothpaste to shampoo, cosmetics, even bottled water. And probably the most famous brand of bottled water was called Radithor. And you can Google this because some of the ads are out of the gate. There was one bloke called Eden Byers who was a socialite back then. He drank 1,400 bottles of it in just a few years. He maintained it gave him energy and a boost and a healthy glow, probably with no irony intended there. But his horrific death, where his jaw literally fell off, culminated in what may be the greatest headline of all time. The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. I cannot believe that that's an actual headline. Headlines now are boring in comparison. Then, of course, came the radium girls. They were young watch dial painters, and they used to paint watch faces with radium paint because it would glow in the dark, and they were used a lot in the war. To paint those fine numbers, they would sharpen the point of the brush between their lips and dip it in radium powder. So, of course, they ingested a lot of radium. Now, they were very young women, and radium is an alpha particle emitter. And what did I say about ingesting it? Massive harm. Their jaws started to crumble, their teeth started to fall out, they had agonizing pain. And eventually the girls linked it to what they were doing. But of course, industry being its usual self, they denied all liability. And the book Radium Girls, which is all about this story, is one of the most enraging, fascinating, horrifying books you'll ever read. But I highly, highly recommend it. In 1917, Ernest Rutherford, and yes, of course, if you grew up in Aotearoa, you probably know that name. He was born in Nelson and trained at Canterbury University. He fired alpha particles into nitrogen and briefly produced oxygen. Now, a lot of people say that this is splitting the atom. Technically not true. He isn't actually the first person to split the atom. Technically, he created something called a transmutation. Perhaps not as catchy, though, really, is it? And for the record, his Nobel Prize in 1908 wasn't for that. He won the prize in chemistry for effectively unraveling radioactivity. I know a few weeks ago that Trump claimed that the US split the atom. They didn't do it either. It was a lot of people at a lot of different times. And after some complicated calculations that I don't ever want to see, they realized how much energy that splitting one atom released, and it's unfathomable. It's millions of times more energy than a chemical reaction. 7 years later, of course, we saw the deadly power of atomic energy over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where they killed well in excess of 100,000 people. And nuclear energy got its hideous reputation before it had even powered a single light bulb. Not really a strong start. But how does a nuclear reactor actually work? You know how radiation works now. You have the fundamental understanding of particle physics. But what happens inside a reactor? Now, just to be very clear, I'm also talking fission here. There are two types of nuclear power, nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. So if you imagine a giant steel thermos, for lack of a better term, it's as big as a house and it's packed with bundles of slender metal tubes. And inside those tubes are thumb-sized ceramic pellets of uranium. To get the reaction started, there is something called a starter, which drips a few neutrons every second. One of those neutrons will bump into a uranium nucleus. The uranium nucleus will split. That's fission. Out comes heat, more neutrons, and gamma radiation. Now, of course, some of those neutrons will go away and hit other uranium atoms, perpetuating the reaction. Whether that reaction keeps on going depends on a few things, like how tightly the fuel is packed. If the rods are too far apart, most of those new electrons will just shoot off into the steel wall or the water that's cooling the reactor. If it's fewer than one neutron from each atom split, then the reaction is called subcritical and just peters out. No steam, no heat, no electricity. If the rods are close enough together in water, that slows the neutrons, because remember, those neutrons have to be slow to hit that uranium nucleus. The odds get a little bit better. Now, on average, exactly one neutron from each nucleus split hits another nucleus. So the chain becomes self-sustaining, and that is called criticality. That is the sweet spot, and that is what a perfectly operational nuclear power plant wants. Doesn't always go that way. Then, of course, if you really pack that fuel in, or if you yank out safety gear, which are control rods, suddenly more neutrons hit more nuclei, and suddenly you have a runaway chain reaction that produces a tremendously terrifying amount of heat and energy. That's called supercritical, and I can't imagine anything scarier than seeing something like that in a control room. So keeping that reaction in the core balanced is the job of a few things, control rods being one of them. These are long blades of neutron-hungry metal alloys. They absorb or moderate the neutrons. So if you push them deeper into the core, they absorb more neutrons and the reaction calms down. If you take them out, fewer neutrons are absorbed by the rods the reaction speeds up. Pretty simple. They're like the accelerator and the brake all in one. Really clever, simple design, really. While the chain reaction ticks over, it's generating a lot of heat, and the water that surrounds the core is sucking that heat up to about 300 degrees. And before you say water boils at 100 degrees, it absolutely does. But this water is under pressure, so it can't boil. That terrifyingly hot water is in contact with a heat exchanger. With a completely separate flow of water, the energy is transmitted through the heat exchanger. The water on the outside loop gets warm, flashes into steam. The steam spins a turbine. The turbine spins a generator, and there you have electricity. The steam will eventually condense back into water, and then the loop carries on. What's left behind in the core is nuclear ash, fission byproducts. They stay hot and radioactive for decades. This is nuclear waste. You've all heard about the terrifying barrels of green goo that are stacked inside a mountain just waiting to kill us all. That's a fear, not fact. Those spent fuel rods will cool in a pool of water for years before they are moved into concrete and lead-lined containers, and then they're recycled or stored. And yes, we can actually recycle them. So the atoms are split, the water boils, the turbines spin, and we have power. If you keep the coolant flowing, that's the water. The control rod's responsive, and then really you just have a very temperamental kettle. But if you lose that cooling, or if those control rods are not well engineered, as we're about to explore, then you have some problems. There was first some smaller incidents, like the wind scale fire in Britain. Then, of course, there was the particular big ones that will absolutely come to mind when you think of nuclear power. Start with the one that you may not have heard of, which is 3 Mile Island. It's just before 4 a.m. on Wednesday, the 28th of March in 1979. In the control room of Unit 2 at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, a minor glitch is about to get a lot worse. 2 feed water pumps trip. So the reactor's turbine and the reactor itself shuts off. All good. There are a lot of fail-safes in nuclear power plants. A relief valve which bleeds out the pressure gets stuck open. First problem. Now super hot coolant is streaming out, but the indicator light on the panel shows only that the signal to close the valve was sent, not that it actually closed, which was a silly oversight, but hindsight's 2020, right? Operators who see that the pressure is dropping don't assume the valve is stuck. They just assume they have too much water, so they start pumping it out. Very quickly, the top of the core, which is supposed to always be submerged with water, is sticking out. As a result, they have a partial meltdown. And this is the first time that word really becomes mainstream, because this was also around the time that TV became mainstream. So this was streamed live constantly across the world. The problem is no one had any idea what was going on, because this isn't the kind of thing that anybody expected. There was no manuals telling them how to handle it. Everyone was running around panicking. It was assumed that this was going to be a catastrophic disaster. In the end, they solved the problem. There was not a single radiation death or injury. The public dose is less than a chest x-ray. But the damage is done in terms of confidence, because you've got news anchors talking about radioactive clouds of doom and mutant fish swimming around. That's a Simpsons reference. Meltdown becomes a word we all now associate with nuclear power. Not a good word. And every single reactor incident since then has been framed through those terms. The next one, of course, is the legend itself. In 1986, on the 26th of April, at about 1 o'clock in the morning, when you're at your best, operators at number 4 reactor in the Chernobyl power plant are running a safety test, ironically. But it's already riddled with errors and mistakes, and despite clear guidelines saying to stop, they don't. They've pulled too many control rods, which are those things that speed up or slow down a reaction. They've disabled automatic shutdown systems, and they have let the power drop to an unstable level. The reactor is not in a good place. It is filled with waste products, which cause problems. They start the test. The power skyrockets in seconds to more than 100 times the reactor's rating. Superheated water flashes to steam. It explodes the 2,000-ton biological shield off the reactor and shatters fuel channels. There's a second explosion because reactors are often associated with hydrogen, and that tosses chunks of breathtakingly radioactive graphite onto the roof of the reactor. That graphite is not only radioactive, it's also on fire. And as the reactor has no separate containment building, all of those radioactive products that are leaking straight from the core are blowing straight into the atmosphere. But they didn't actually know that at the time. If you've seen the miniseries, you'll know through a level of ego and bureaucracy and ignorance, they refused to believe what had happened because it was not supposed to be able to happen. So fire crews arrived in just jeans and ordinary coats, and they have no idea that the stuff they're walking across is lethally radioactive. 2 men die in the explosions, 28 more die due to exposure to that radiation. And in the days that follow, a plume of very radioactive isotopes, such as iodine-131 and cesium-137, drift across Europe. And that is where the global concern came from. And the very real worry that it could wipe out or at least affect most of Europe. 116,000 people were evacuated. The Soviets stayed quiet about it until they could no longer contain the disaster, and the rest is largely history. Now, this is where the idea of deaths due to radiation gets a bit grey, because the long-term cancer toll is still massively debated and there is not a single definitive number. But even if you look at the highest possible number, it's about 200,000. 200,000 is horrific if that's true, if that's the real number. But cancer is one of those things that we are so frightened of that seems so much worse than the idea of air pollution. That psychological scar was massive. It obviously led to an awful lot of change in the industry, which was well overdue, but it also totally tainted public perception of nuclear energy. And then finally, the one which I almost think eroded the most confidence was Fukushima, which is obviously the most recent. Happened on the 11th of March in 2011, so not very long ago. They had a massive earthquake. I think it was a 9.0, which is, I'm in Christchurch. I was here for an earthquake that almost leveled my city. That was a 6 point something. I can't even fathom a 9. At the Fukushima Daiichi plant, they had 3 operating reactors. The earthquake, they shut down as they were supposed to. Great safeguards. 40 minutes later, there was a 14-metre tsunami that was twice as high as the tsunami walls, unfortunately, because, of course, you never know how bad something could be until it will happen. The tsunami slammed into the power plant. It swamped the electrical switchgear. All the cooling pumps shut down. It's very bad because the biggest issue with nuclear reactors is you've got to keep them cool. The fuel rods overheat. Their cladding reacts with steam. That creates hydrogen. Hydrogen, of course, is really quite explosive. And over the next 3 days, those 3 reactor buildings explode in quite spectacular fashion all over global news. Crews have no choice but to vent radioactive steam off into the atmosphere. Of course, more recently disposed of radioactive wastewater into the ocean, which has been met with the reaction you'd expect, but dilution, it is not a concern. Eventually they get everything under control, but they have to evacuate about 150,000 residents. And officials later trace 51 deaths to the chaotic evacuation itself rather than radiation. And they have so far confirmed 1 fatal cancer due to radiation exposure. But those images of the explosions and the blue-lit fuel pools, again, what an evocative image. Hazmat suits, contaminated soil, cancer, death and destruction, creepy green glows. And the reason I think this was one of the most impactful for us psychologically is that this was driven by a natural disaster, which is something we cannot plan for. We can try and mitigate the effects, but we never really do it that well. And the second one is that people have an awful lot of faith in Japanese engineering and safety standards. And this happened in one of the places people considered nuclear energy the safest, despite the earthquake risk, showing that perhaps actually nuclear energy is not to be trusted, which is not the truth. Radiation is equal parts fascinating and horrifying. But is it actually that horrifying? Because what I have talked through just now isn't super fun bedtime reading, but is the risk actually that high? And I'm going to spoil next week's episode because the answer is no. And next week I'm going to be going over why. I'm going to answer the big questions like, how big is the radioactive waste mountain? Is it all in barrels of green goo that are seeping into the ground, creating mutant fish? Can we have mini reactors, like lunchbox-sized ones that power homes or villages? That would be very cool. What the hell is thorium salt? What is fusion? Are we any closer to cracking it? And then, of course, the biggest of all, do we truly need it to prevent further climate change? But I'm afraid you're going to have to wait till next week to understand why.